This presentation gives a bit of background to the methods that we use in quantitative research to generate data, or in other words, data collection methods. And this is what we'll discuss in more detail in our second session. So, four key quantitative research methods that we can discuss include surveys, structured interviews, experiments, and content analysis. So we're going to say a word about each of these in this session, although we will focus more in the actual delivery session for this topic on surveys. That'll be the key thing. It's the key method discussed in the module descriptor. Well, most of us are familiar with surveys in one form or another, and indeed have probably been a participant in surveys if we haven't actually administered one. So the key thing about surveys is that it relates to a large number of individuals. We can't talk about surveys unless we're talking about large numbers, and that's why this is in the quantitative research domain. Two terms that are important here are the terms population and sample. So population is a complete set of individuals, whereas most of the time we can't actually find information from the population, we can only get a sample. In the UK, for example, the nearest thing we get to surveying the whole population is the census that takes place every 10 years. But even then, we don't necessarily catch absolutely everybody. So samples are what we usually deal with when we're trying to get responses from large numbers of people. We don't get them all, we just get a sample. So the process of obtaining that information is called sampling. Very often that sampling is aimed to be random. The individuals are selected randomly with no bias introduced, and we'll discuss that in more detail in the session. There are many different types of surveys, and this slide just distinguishes between analytical, where the idea is to try and find some associations. So, for example, if you happen to be a biscuit manufacturer, what sort of people like your biscuits? What are the two things that go together? And that's more on the quantitative end of the spectrum, more quantitative or positivist in terms of paradigm. And it could well be confirmatory in the sense of research design. In other words, you already have a hunch what you think those associations are, and your survey aims to confirm that. That word deductive means the same sort of thing, really. You've already got an idea or a hypothesis, and you wish to prove or disprove that idea. A descriptive survey, by contrast, is something that is going out there to find out without any preconceived ideas what the situation is like, what are the characteristics, what are the trends. For example, you may not have any idea how many people eat biscuits in a particular part of Wales, so you're going out there fresh, as it were, to explore that. That word inductive means the same sort of thing. You have no preconceived ideas, and you're aiming to, if you like, develop ideas or develop theory. So the type of survey that you would use depends on your research question, depends on the nature of what you need to know. So most surveys involve the use of questionnaires, and we'll talk about the nature of those in more detail. There are two main questions, really, two main types of question. One is a closed question with a limited range of answers, and the other is an open question where you're asking people what they think. And that's, it's not uncommon to find both in a questionnaire. However, if you are aiming to generate quantitative data, then your questions are more likely to be closed because it's very hard to quantify open questions. However, they have their place and they may be very important in the context of a survey. So a couple of further terms with respect to sampling that you may not have come across before. So the sampling frame is the list of units in the population from which the sample is selected. So it may well be that you can't do the whole country, you are just looking at certain counties or certain states. A representative sample is a sample that reflects the population. So if you want your sample to be representative, then you better not ignore the very old or the very young, or conversely, the ones in the middle. You need to get across the range of the people you wish to survey. Sampling error is a term that you may encounter in different ways, but it's not usually a mistake. It's not that somebody has made an error. It's just that there is some discrepancy between the sample and the population, which may be perfectly explicable. It may not be that somebody's done something wrong. And a further couple of terms, probability sampling is the same thing as random sampling. It's where you know the probability of being selected, that each individual has an equal probability of being selected, really. Whereas non-probability or non-random sampling, then some people have more chance than others of being selected. And again, this is not unusual and sometimes perfectly reasonable given the situation that you might be in. So for example, convenience sampling is where you sample in a convenience place. You're giving out your questionnaires outside a particular shop, for example. Purposeful sampling, let's say you have a survey of people with arthritis. Well, you need to survey people with arthritis. You need to purposely find them. Snowball sampling is where your first participant asks their friend or family or whatever it happens to be, and you build up a range of participants via a snowball effect of one person contacting another. And again, especially where you've got minorities in some way, that may be perfectly reasonable. But the default position, the accepted, if you like, best practice would be random sampling. Interviews are generally considered to be more in the qualitative domain of research, but they can be quantitative if they're highly structured. And you can see that in this slide, on the left-hand side, we have a situation where the questions asked are highly structured. And in that sense, it's not dissimilar to a questionnaire, only where the questions are being asked. And in fact, in many surveys, there will be interviews interspersed with questionnaires, for example, via the phone. And so there are pros and cons of using interviews in that way. One con, I suppose, is the fact that it takes a great deal of time and effort to actually arrange. Um, anyway, again, something to discuss at more length. A very important research method or research design, also we could say, within the quantitative area are experiments. And it may well be that you're not likely to undertake any experiments, but it's important to know about them. So in an experimental design, there is one or more experimental groups, usually randomly assigned, in which one variable is manipulated and another variable, or possibly more than one variable, is measured. So the variable that's manipulated is called the independent variable. So that could be, for example, the dose of drug that's given, or the amount of time that somebody is left to do something. And the dependent variable then is measured. So that could be blood pressure, heart rate, test score, all sorts of things. That's the experimental group. And there's also an control group in which there's no manipulation. But there may be placebos and all sorts of things. And of course, there's an awful lot one can say about experiments, which I'm not going to deal with really. So a very important type of quantitative research approach, not something we're going to dwell on, but something to know about. And something to be aware about is the fact that even the very best experimental design can be very vulnerable to what we would call confounding variables. So you think you're getting a result which reflects your independent variable, and actually it's reflecting something completely different. Now, although it's not that typical to find experimental designs in the area of social research, it's not impossible, and you can see here that we have terms such as quasi-experimental studies and naturalistic studies, where there is a sort of an experimental design, but it's not following the typical pattern in a precise way. It mirrors what is actually, as it were, in the field or in the work situation or whatever. A last quantitative research method that I'm going to comment on here is content analysis. And this is actually a method which can also be used in a qualitative way, and often is. And what this means is the analysis of content, which could be all sorts of things. It could be documents, texts, other media. It usually involves some sort of coding, especially in the qualitative sense. But if it's a quantitative approach, then the sort of thing that happens is that people are looking for numbers of things. So, for example, it could be a newspaper editor who wants to know which topic occurred most frequently in readers' letters, and this will influence perhaps the choice of article in the future editions. So that can be done using software and a very easy approach if that's what you do. A last slide here to introduce two key terms that relate to quantitative research methods, and they are validity and reliability. And it's not uncommon to see reference to these in journal articles which are focused on quantitative research. So validity means the degree to which research outcomes are valid. They actually are getting at the topic that you're trying to get at. So for example, if you've measured something, is it a valid reflection of the concept that you were trying to get at? So for example, does the number of times a person enter a shop reflect the popularity of the products of that shop, or is it actually something completely different? Reliability is the degree to which the research outcomes are consistent and do not fluctuate. So it's very similar to repeatability. And again, if you are undertaking quantitative research, you would expect that if you undertook the same method, let's say an experiment, you'd get the same result each time. So this slide just gives some summary points of the preceding slides, and the last slide once again provides you with some further reading.